outside? Should I run and hide? How do I take my company worldwide? Do you love the law? Did you watch Hee-Haw? What's the weirdest thing that you ever saw? What's it like in court? Favorite sport? Can you help with my book report? Is my hair too long? Am I right or wrong? And do you mind if I sing along to anything? Ask Alan anything in the world.
All right. Hello, everybody. This is Alan Crone. I'm the CEO of the Crone Law Firm, and welcome to this episode of Ask Alan, the podcast. I'm really excited to have an entrepreneur's entrepreneur on the program today, Michael Mogill, who's the founder and CEO of Crisp Video, and he's on a mission. I'll let him tell you what his mission is, but his company has certainly helped me. Michael, full disclosure, is a friend and a confidant of mine, and has helped me through 2020. And I don't care if you're a lawyer or an entrepreneur or just someone living life in 2020 in America. Michael has got some great messages to share with you. Michael, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us a little bit, before we just dive into it, tell us a little bit about Crisp Video and what your mission is.
Yeah, so Crisp, we work exclusively with law firms at this point. Our vision, is essentially we want to help 1,000 law firms grow their revenues by at least $1 million each over the next 5 years. And the reason for that, and you kind of added up 1,000 law firms, $1 million each, it's a $1 billion impact. But really at the core of it, it's if you can help a firm grow either to $1 million or by $1 million, what we found typically is, what happens is the infrastructure of the firm, the sustainability of the firm, there's now a team in place, the impact that they're able to make within their communities becomes exponential. It's not just incremental. So, our way of being able to impact communities nationwide is being able to help our clients help their clients. Now,
I know that one of my favorite business books is Good to Great. And they talk, he talks about overnight successes, and it only takes them 20 years to get there. Somebody from the outside looking in may look at your business and say, of course, it just sprung up as a successful business, but that wasn't always the case, was it?
No, not at all. I mean, I was just thinking about as you were mentioning this. Looking back, I think, Crisp has been around. We just, past 9 years. So I guess you could say that's a 9-year overnight success. But really, once I started, I started my first business back when I was, 13 years old. And then, and then ultimately even coming out of college, I started what wasn't Crisp, but was the precursor to Crisp. So that was probably at this point, almost 14, 15 years ago. So it's, it's taken a while. I think a lot of times what people see, a lot of what Crisp is today, and as we've grown, this is really, I'd say really the last 3 years. But leading up to this, I didn't take a salary or anything like that. I didn't pay myself, year after year after year for really the first almost 5-6 years or so. And, we were constantly reinvesting into the business. We still are. We never took any loans, never had any investors, no partners, nothing like that. But I think if you have a long-term outlook, if you're really focusing on reinvesting back into the business, so in terms of hiring people, infrastructure, and so on, versus trying, I think where many entrepreneurs make the mistake is trying to take the profit out too early. You can really build something great.
So when you started, did your folks sell a bunch of Coca-Cola stock and give you capital to start? How did you get started?
No, it's funny. So my family and I, we immigrated from Eastern Europe. So I like to joke. There's no immigrant trust fund. So first generation here. My dad, back in Russia, he was an engineer. My mom was a nurse. When they came here, they had to start over. And they came here basically my parents, my grandparents, my brother, and I. And when they got here, they had $500 to their name. So we, I've always had loving parents who were very supportive, but financially, we didn't grow up with much. We lived in a lot of low-income housing and things like that growing up. But we had opportunity. My brother and I. Ironically, I would later go on to start Crisp with $500 to my name. But I would say that there's a lot of opportunity for those that are willing to get after it. I think it's a privileged situation to be in America. I think it's a privileged situation that I went to college and I graduated from college, completely unrelated field. I was a biology major. But no, I mean, in terms of the financial resources, did not have that, had to figure it out. But looking back now, I mean, I look at that as, as a blessing, if you will, because how resourceful you have to be, the things you have to learn, and so on as a result. So again, I think it's an advantage.
Yeah, through you, I got to see Gary Vaynerchuk live, and he talks about the same kind of thing. That it really is, in a way, to be an entrepreneur, it's almost an advantage to have nothing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, because I think when you start, it's where I've seen a lot of people struggle. It's if you start and you really don't have anything to lose. So like when you're not giving up a Mercedes or a nice home or whatever it is, you're not having to really downgrade your quality of life because you're kind of starting at a ground zero, if you will. I think that's a lot easier, when you're going all in, especially when you're starting out. What I think is trickier is if you're having to give up a lot of those luxuries and having to basically say, okay, now I can no longer live in the home we live in or the condo we live in because I have to start this business. Now we got to sell the car and all these different things. For a lot of people, I think they're going to be very averse to doing those things. So in my experience, it's easier when you kind of start with nothing, right, and build up to something than when you're having to let's say we see people that are, let's say they're in a good high-paying job, they're doing well, but they want to kind of take the entrepreneurial route. It's a lot harder to give up the, high-paying job and then, go 3, 4, 5 years without paying yourself, So I think for that reason, it kind of keeps them where they are.
Yeah, I agree. I know a lot of lawyers who are in a comfortable situation, and it's that comfort that keeps you from moving sometimes, because you don't want to give up the comfort. But you could propel yourself into even greater comfort, I guess, is maybe the way to look at it. How important do you think having a mission-based business is?
Well, I'll tell you what, over the years, I've viewed it as increasingly more and more important. I think when we're starting out, for many of us, as entrepreneurs, and I didn't think of myself as an entrepreneur or anything when I was starting the company. I didn't even know what that was. But I think the initial goal is, okay, let's get that first client, or let's get some money in the door, or let's meet payroll, whatever it is. I find that in the short term, early on, there's financial goals. But what really drives a business, into the future and really continues to grow, to prevent any complacency for setting in, or even preventing, from people taking their foot off the gas. If you have a financial target, the challenge is that once you hit it, then it's like, then what, But if you have, let's say, a greater vision, an impact target, and so on, like at that point, it's, it becomes insatiable, right? So it's meaning that even once you hit some sort of financial goal, it's always like, what's next? How do we get to the next level? And so on, because, you have this vision that's tied to impacting people. And if you realize that vision, why would you not want to continue to extend that and go beyond? So I find that the most successful entrepreneurs that grow their organizations the most are always ones that have a very clear vision, a very clear mission, all those things outlined. And again, I know what this sounds like to somebody, let's say, who's hearing this and they're struggling. They're saying, well, mission and vision is nice, but what I really need right now are sales, or what I really need is revenue. And what I've learned is that those things become the byproduct of being so committed to the vision. So when you're committed to it, now you're making decisions based on, like, how do we, impact our community? How do we support our clients? All those different things, which end up being better decisions in the long run. And as a result, the revenue comes as a byproduct.
Many of our viewers may not know, but Michael has a great podcast himself called the Game Changing Attorney podcast. And I listen to that frequently. And even if you're not a lawyer, you're an entrepreneur, if you just listen and substitute your business for what these folks are talking about, I think you can find it helpful. And one thing that I'm struck by, Michael, is the number of entrepreneurs, lawyers, whether there's someone like John Morgan, who's a giant, or Alex Shinara in Alabama, or Eric Chafin, or any of the ones you've had on your show. They all say that. They all talk about, at some point you go from your goal being money to your goal being building something bigger than yourself, and the money kind of comes from that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, because ultimately this will come down to, how do you want to spend your time? Because I think money, if we're looking at it in terms of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and something along those lines, like money is great if you need it for, let's say, to pay off student loans, or you needed to be able to buy a home, or you needed to be able to, let's say, like, I think if you needed to expand the business in particular, let's say you need to be buy an office or hire additional team members and so on, I think, yes, then money makes sense. But if you have those resources, then what, right? Like, how do you justify additional growth, right? If meaning that, like, can you justify it if, let's say you're at, 20 million, how do you justify 21 million if you knew that additional million meant that you may not be able to spend as much time with your family and kids? Is it still worth it? So I think it only, if you're going kind of the long game with it, you'll only be fully committed to something if it's going to be transformational in your life. And then I think that those are going to be not monetary goals, but rather impact goals.
A lot of my listeners, I think, are entrepreneurs or budding entrepreneurs. And one question that I get asked a lot is, someone comes to me for a business formation and, how do I pick my business? And you're not too far removed from that. How did you decide, I see a market here. I want to try to help lawyers with great videos. Why lawyers, and how did you go from kind of being a generalist to focusing just on lawyers?
Yeah, well, so we certainly didn't start out that way. When I started the company, it was originally evolved from another business, but originally I kind of built Crisp around our ideal clients, which were our corporate clients. So at the time we were in the brand space, working with the Coca-Colas of the world, or, Red Bull or Verizon and so on, kind of like the agency model, if you will. And then we started to work in different industries like dental and medical and tech and financial and so on. Legal happened by accident. We had a lawyer who came to us, and she had no online presence and was really struggling to compete against the big mass advertisers in her market. At the time, online video isn't what it is today. We created great content for her. We got the content online, and her business exploded. And we did it for another firm and then another firm. And what I saw, at least in the legal industry, was that you've got a traditionally very saturated, commoditized markets, if you will. So there's a lot of supply, and competing for at times the same demand. And consumers also struggle to differentiate one firm from another. Like, they oftentimes can't tell who's a good lawyer from who may not be a not so great attorney. So I think that was an opportunity for the kind of marketing that we were doing, which was very much based on humanizing, telling storytelling, articulating what sets a firm apart. That was initially geared towards not the massive firms, the mass advertisers, but rather like, great attorneys that perhaps were not, amazing marketers, but didn't have the resources to do things like traditional advertising, like TV and radio and billboards and so on. So I think that's how it really started. And we found in our case that we could make a much greater impact for businesses and small businesses than we ever could for, Coca-Cola or what have you. So that's where that focus shifted. Me being an entrepreneur myself, I think this is really kind of the root of it. It's like, who can we really make the greatest impact for? And then I also learned a very powerful lesson of focus, and, to really niche down into a particular industry, where I see a lot of businesses, they try to be in multiple industries. They try to be for everyone. They basically try to be everything. And it's very, very difficult to build not only a tremendous amount of trust and credibility, but it's very difficult to specialize when you're for everyone. So I would advise anybody who's, let's say a budding entrepreneur who wants to start a business, to really get clear on who they're for and really focus and niche down. What's the quote? Like the riches are in the niches. But I think a lot of that is because primarily, like, we can build a lot of trust and credibility within the legal industry. We can start a legal podcast. We can write a book on legal marketing. We can host legal webinars. But if we take the exact same model, let's say to another industry, let's say like the financial industry, for example, even if we provide the exact same service, we have not established any credibility or trust. So I think when you try to be in so many industries, you're not really building kind of the trust or credibility in any of them, and you're not seen as the go-to in any industry, which is why I think focus is such a powerful thing.
Right. Talked about books. Michael's written a book called The Game Changing Attorney, and it's a great book. And I got one of the first copies when it came out, almost 2 years ago now.
2 years, yep.
And I hear, now you don't have to confirm this rumor, but I hear that maybe there's another book in the offing. We certainly want more than one book, but if you're a lawyer and you'd like to get a hold of this, Michael didn't ask me to do this, but I'm not shilling for him. I don't get a kickback or anything, but I'll be glad to send you a copy of The Game Changing Attorney, because, and I'm talking to the lawyers right now, I think I'll just talk for myself, and how many of you can identify with this. I think lawyers are always looking for the magic bullet. And we always assume that there's one thing, if I just do this one thing, that's going to make the big difference for me. And the one thing I've learned in working with Michael and Chris over the last 2 or 3 years is that it's not one thing. It's a whole bunch of different things, but doing them, being disciplined and doing them repeatedly and hanging in there for the long haul. As a former law partner of mine, Miles Mason, would say, this is a long con. It's not a short con. And you got to establish that trust. And Michael, who was somebody in your life that, I know that you weren't born with that realization. Who was it that really was the biggest influence on you, on your philosophy, that philosophy of building trust for the long haul?
Man, so I mean, I'm such an avid reader. I'll tell you, when you write a book or you do a podcast or something like that, it almost creates this forcing function where you start to, to read a lot more, consume a lot more content, that type of stuff. So you always kind of, to stay on the cutting edge. I will say that, from a customer service client experience standpoint, like Joey Coleman wrote a great book called Never Lose a Customer Again. Tony Hsieh wrote from Zappos, wrote the book Delivering Happiness. I think that was a really great book. I read early in my career on culture. There's Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink. I mean, so it's a number of those, but I will say it's so interesting. When you've got a vision and you're clear on it, and you can think, let's say, for the long term, you can make decisions that are based on, let's say, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, wherever you want to take the business, that perhaps you would have otherwise not have made if there's only a short-term focus and a short-term goal. And what I've seen even through my experience is that the things that have the greatest upside are the ones that take a while. You got to water them. You've got to stay committed to them. You've got to stay consistent to them. That sometimes it's going to be a while, like months, maybe even years, until you see a return on them. That doesn't make them the wrong things. It more often than not makes them the right things. But you'll find that most people aren't willing to do them because they don't see the immediate return from them. So you see a lot of short-term thinking. You kind of see, like, I guess the example that I've given is like, you see people kind of burning down the forest every year and then trying to plant new trees at the start of the following year, rather than really trying to like build something great and thinking about, okay, the decision I'm making today, like, does that still make sense 3 years from now? Is the person that I'm hiring today, does that person still make sense a year from now, 2 years from now, and what have you? And then when you make decisions like that, like, I think that's where you can really build something that's, that's massive, if you will, but certainly something with a strong foundation.
You're in a unique position because you talk to a lot of lawyers, and your company talks to even more. And I'm trying to figure a way to answer this question because I don't want it to be a negative question. But what is a strategy that you see a lot of law firms think is a good idea? And I know every situation is different, but that normally doesn't work out well for them. Does that make sense as a question?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting. Al, you mentioned it earlier, and there's really two things. I mean, there's probably a dozen things, but like two that come to mind initially. One strategy that I've seen has never worked out well and has like really never built anything long term is any firm owner that like has a strong year or hits a big case or whatever it is, and then takes that money and puts it back in their pocket as opposed to putting it back into the business. On the podcast, like the most successful firm owners, it's so interesting. Like they all had a story like this. They had a strong year or they had a big case, and then they took that money and put it right back into the firm, into the marketing, into hiring, into infrastructure, technology, whatever it was. And then that became the catalyst for what the firm is today. And had they not done that, it would have never grown. So there's really, I think, two types of firm owners. One that take that money and pay themselves first. And then others that, invest in the business first and are really focusing on like, how do we build something great? That's one. I mean, but the other one that you mentioned, like I think a very common mistake is this belief that there is a magic bullet, holy water, snake oil, whatever it is. And, just because, I think there's a lot of marketing out there that has this, like I think sometimes, people want to there's what people want versus what people need. So people want to hear, how do I, here's how you grow the law firm with no work, no time investment, no financial investment. It's easy and simple. I mean, like, of course, like that sounds amazing. Like who would not want to grow a business on the beach while doing absolutely nothing? But the reality of it is, like, I have never in any, with any lawyer ever in America, I mean, if someone's listening to this and they know of an example, like, I will come out on record and correct this. I've never seen anybody succeed through any of those things, but I've consistently seen firm owners succeed where they stay committed to the things that they're doing. They invest in their people, they invest in their marketing, they stick with their partners, they stick with their vendors, like, the things where they kind of stick with things for the long haul, and, and don't jump and treat, whatever they're investing in as almost like a kitchen timer, right? Where everything has an expiration date. It's hard to make progress if you're not, sticking with things or committed to things, especially for those that are most worthwhile. So, like, I find that while many people will say we need leads or whatever it is, like the phone's not ringing or what have you, usually it's not a lead problem. In fact, almost always it's not a lead problem, but rather a reputation problem. Or, in my reputation, what I mean is that, like, it foundationally in the firm, is the firm known? Is the firm trusted? Are there, is the experience they're providing to their clients so good that other clients come back and refer cases back to them? Is the intake right? All these things. You rarely ever hear of anybody that has all that dialed in, whoever has a lead problem. It's always the other way around.
Right. And, everybody thinks that, well, there's that one case, just like it's the same thing. Everybody thinks there's that one case out there that's going to solve all my problems. And, there may be, but that if there's a systematic deficiency, it's not going to solve that systematic deficiency. You'll be back where you were before you got the big case. What do you see as any trends in the legal profession since you started working solely with lawyers that you think is important for people to start thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is I think the greatest opportunities for growth are always going to be in areas where you can either specialize or there's like high margin work. Because I think, I always think about the converse, the stuff that we're seeing automated, or that, there's danger of it going away, or it will go away the soonest, when you're starting to see like non-lawyer firm ownership, things like that. A lot of that kind of stuff is, a lot of low margin work. A lot of it is transactional, but the firms that I think they're going to be protected and actually in a better situation are the ones that are more specialized, where the work that they're doing requires, let's say, either litigation or something that is not something that can be easily automated, right? So it's really trying, looking at it from the standpoint of like, here's why our clients really need us, and here's the impact that we're making. And if somebody at another firm could easily replicate what it is that you're doing, then chances are neither firm is going to survive for the long term, especially what we're seeing with like the evolution of like technology and the legal industry's adaptation of technology, which I think was expedited this year. So I think that's one of them for sure. So those that like are specialized and focused. And then the other big differentiator that we're seeing is that, firms that are realizing that their competition really isn't other law firms anymore. I think nowadays consumers have like almost been re-indexed through their experience with brands like Amazon or Starbucks or what have you, that now they have an expectation of great customer service and client experience. Like they have, this, expectation of getting like consistent updates and so on, that, I don't want to speak dirty words, but like, I think it's becoming more and more important for law firm owners to really understand the business of law, which means understanding things like, how can I be a better leader? How can I lead a greater, a better team? How can I make sure that our culture is right, that our client experience is right? All those things matter, I think at this point, almost as much, if not more, than the actual, providing of legal services.
Yeah, I think one issue that is more and more a problem for lawyers, particularly, and I want to be the old guy in the room, but I find that a lot of lawyers don't pick up the phone, use some good old 20th century technology to stay in touch with their clients. I know I'm guilty of it. I send an email or a text or whatever, but it's that personal touch is what's going to get you the referral. Great videos help, and blogs and all those things help, but at the end of the day, it's a relationship business.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think it's relationships, not even just like, as you mentioned, with clients, but other, referring lawyers and people in the community and so on. if people are listening to this and they're like, man, that sounds like a lot of work. I got to know all this stuff. I got to grow as a leader. I got to develop a better team. We got to have better infrastructure. We have to have systems and processes and KPIs and all these different things. I mean, yeah. I mean, so if the goal is to build something that is, going to be sustainable, consistent, predictable, and scalable, yes. I mean, I think that's kind of that's par for the course. But the reality of it is, I think neglecting those things puts many firms at a competitive disadvantage, because there's always somebody in the market, like, a guy like yourself, who is committed to these things. So you can't just simply exist or coast anymore. But it's a good thing overall. I think that it's elevating the perception of the legal profession. I think it's good for clients and consumers and so on. So, but it's understanding that those things are now, like, understanding the business side of law, customer service, client experience, intake. I mean, these things are a necessity to really be in the game and stick around long enough.
Yeah, take it from me. You can't just come in and practice law and throw up a website and ignore the business side of it, because the margins are too narrow and the cost of everything is too great. Without leverage, you're not going to be able to make any money. I don't care what kind of practice you have, because there's always somebody who's bigger that has more economies of scale that you have to compete with. And, unless you're John Morgan, but I would even imagine, Morgan is worried about, all these things, and he doesn't spend all of his time trying cases anymore either. So it's all about the business part of it. And I know a lot of lawyers really resist that because they say, well, I'm a legal professional, and you can't have your own firm and ignore the business side of it. There's just no doubt about it.
Yeah. Or I mean, so I would say it depends on your goals. If you have zero interest in the business side of it, but you still want to run a successful law firm, hire somebody, to run the firm. Either hire a CEO or a COO or what have you. But you can't be an absentee owner. I mean, that's what I'll say. I mean, at the end of the day, I think you have to have a very active role in the business. I'm one of these people. I know people say, oh, you shouldn't micromanage or what have you, and like they view it as such a bad or negative thing. I think people inspect what or respect what you inspect. And, if you play an active role in your business, if you know your numbers, if you know what's going on, if you, are consistently meeting with your team members, if you're consistently speaking with your clients, I mean, I think if you're going to dedicate your time in some way and you're going to be committed to something, go all in with it and truly enjoy it. But if that's not something that you enjoy, I'd say at least find or hire the person who does enjoy those things. But the reality of it is, if you don't like any of that stuff and then you're not focusing on any of it, it's very difficult to be competitive. Right.
And I think there's a subtle but important difference between micromanaging and providing leadership and accountability. And, it's not micromanaging to ask follow-up questions. It's micromanaging to take it out of their hands and do it yourself. And you're not going to be able to scale that way.
Absolutely. I mean, and I would say at its core, what I have seen, if I were to drill it down to like really two core like concepts, because I think business is simple at the end of the day, but it's also like, it becomes almost like this infinite game of like, once you realize what you don't know, there's just becomes so much more to learn and so on. So at the core, I think, it's really two things. It's like people, if you've got the right ones. And then two is really, I'd say courage. And it's like the willingness to either hire the people or write the check for the marketing or write the check for the building or whatever it is that you're doing, because you can be empowered with all the information. Like you can know everything you need to do. But I find that there's very, very, very few entrepreneurs that are willing to write the check, right? That are willing to commit, that are willing to either have a difficult conversation of let's say, letting go of somebody who's underperforming or in office cancer, or also being willing to hire, an additional attorney or practice manager or whoever it is, even if it's the right decision, like knowing and doing, are two very different things. But even when you look at those two, let's say like those two factors, like there's such a wealth of knowledge that you gain over time. Like, everyone can say, yeah, it's people, but like, what do we have to do to attract the best ones into our organization? What do we have to do to keep them? What do we have to do to engage them? Right. So like, if you wanted, let's say great lawyers have a lot of opportunities. They could go work anywhere. I mean, they're paid well wherever they are. And like, how do you get them to your firm? It's not, it's not just money, because they have a lot of options. So how do you build the type of practice where the best attorneys want to be, so that's what I mean by like, you continuously learn more and more about these concepts over time. And you start to realize like, wow, there's a lot more to it.
Sure. Well, it wouldn't be 2020 without talking about the pandemic. What lessons did you learn, and how did Chris deal with the pandemic?
Wow. Yeah. Well, I will say this, we were not immune. It's funny. It's like the question's always like, how did the company adjust? Because I think everybody adjusted to the pandemic except for Zoom, right? Where basically the world adjusted to them, so we're a business that, half the company travels. So whether we're going to our clients' offices for video shoots or trainings, where we're conducting workshops and so on. So we were greatly impacted by, any type of shutdowns when, flights are grounded, that type of stuff. And I'm looking at half the team, which was, almost 40 people at the time that literally cannot travel. That is really their sole role in the company. It's like, okay, what do we do? Because we didn't know how long, the pandemic was going to last. We took everybody remote and so on. But I think that once you kind of got over the initial shock, which, when people are looking to you, you're like, okay, someone has to have a plan. Someone has to make decisions. You don't know if they're necessarily the right ones, but you have to do something. So we were able to kind of move people into different roles, at least temporarily. So we were able to keep everybody. We didn't have, fortunately, we didn't furlough anybody. We didn't, let anybody go on account of COVID or anything like that. So I think that was a really good thing. But I also found that there was, it created these tremendous opportunities to innovate. So you had to adapt very quickly to technology. If you weren't using Zoom or some sort of video conferencing, you were. If you weren't using things like, voice over IP phone systems or e-sign, I mean, the reality of it is that was the only way that you'd be able to either communicate with clients or move, matters forward, cases forward, deals forward, whatever it is. So you had to adjust. People were starting to do video, remote depositions and things like that. But in our case, it was really like, okay, so what do we do? I mean, imagine when you're shooting videos and that is let's say a service that you sell, and you can't actually go and deliver on that service because flights are either grounded or everybody's terrified of COVID, that, they don't want to interact with a human being, right? Like even the team has to travel and get tested. So, but this has been, I think, one of the greatest, I'm hesitant to say this because it's like, we're still in COVID times and, I want this to come across the right way. So I look back, now in hindsight, I think this has been one of the greatest blessings in a way for the business because of how, the team stepped up, the leadership stepped up, how we basically almost had this pressure on us when you had to adapt and you had to be able to adjust quickly. And, you basically had to figure it out. And to see them do that, I think that's a wonderful thing. Now, do we want the pandemic to end? Absolutely. But to not only survive through that, but to ultimately kind of figure it out and be able to, to thrive in a way. Like this will end up being our most successful year in the history of the company. And if you were to ask me back in March, I would have been like, well, this is probably going to be the least successful year in the history of the company. If we didn't do anything at that point. So meaning that we were set up for the worst year. But again, I think that there's always, what I've learned through a pandemic or any kind of difficult or scary times, the main kind of capability or even skill that becomes prioritized is not your resources. It's not like how much money you have. It becomes your, your adaptability and your flexibility and the speed at which you can make those types of decisions. Because we saw a lot of very successful law firms immediately were shutting down. They were shutting down offices. They were, furloughing their team, where they were just letting people go and so on, that they were not very adaptable. Whereas, going into 2021, we'll see a lot of firms that, were previously, let's say, not big players in the market have now become that because of how they spent their time during COVID. Whereas if you were just a big firm, that was no necessarily guarantee that this year would be any better for you. I think in many times it almost became a disadvantage because of what it was to pivot a cruise ship as opposed to pivoting a business that was more nimble. So again, looking back, I think it builds up a tremendous amount of confidence whenever you go through any kind of difficult time or crisis or anything like that. But to me, it built up a lot of confidence in our leadership team and just in seeing what they were able to do. And then the fact that, I feel like I didn't crack a smile up until a week ago when we actually hit our targets. But it is one of those things where if people fully understood, and the team internally, does, but just how massive of an achievement that is. Alan, as you know, we've hosted a big industry conference for the last 2 years, where we brought in a lot of our new business and clients from that, a large percent from that. And then because of COVID, obviously that didn't happen this year. We moved it to next year. Plus any event that was taking place in person, any conference, anything like that, those weren't an option this year. So you just had to figure out a different way. And it builds confidence when you can figure those things out. So again, I think the bigger thing, the bigger skill set to prioritize is really just your adaptability and flexibility. I saw firms that changed their business model. They changed, maybe a focus on a practice area. Maybe they, early on, they were doing like, drive-in, or kind of like, you'd sign like a will or an estate plan or something like that, like just to figure out, okay, how can we, accommodate the needs of our clients in light of the current climate. And the firms that did it were very successful. And the ones that kind of were sitting in the, kind of waiting it out and waiting for things to get better are still waiting.
Well, I thought one case study that I really would be interested to hear as much as you can share about this. But one of the things that you did very, very early on that I thought was really effective, in fact, I thought it was so effective, I started doing it myself. And that was, you would come on, I don't know if it was daily or every other day, and you would do just a short, almost kind of pep talk or on Facebook, and you'd send it out on social media and so forth. And I thought that was so effective because it showed that you guys were still in the saddle and working. But I suspect that morphed into some actual product offerings over time, didn't it?
Yeah, so we really went in on the vlogging, and like we even watched the podcast. This all happened right around March, and then this was part of like a lot of the team members that we were able to kind of switch up their roles to be able to keep them. We really built a larger content team, if you will. But when we started vlogging, what I saw was just that things got real quiet, especially early on, and there was a lot of people that I guess so-called thought leaders or people in the industry that you just didn't know if they were either still in business or what, because, but at the same time, this is back in March and April and May, like this was a time where people needed more clarity and direction than ever, right? Like other entrepreneurs and other businesses, it's like, what do we do? And although I don't believe that I had all the answers, at the very least, I could document what we were doing and how we were responding. And, at first I wasn't sure, how that would be received and if that would be valuable to anyone. But, we were getting so many messages back about how, inspirational it was, how, just to be able to kind of be transparent and kind of humanize that. I think people value, especially like communities, especially in difficult times where, you may look around like other people in your market or competitors and so on that may not want to share, or may not want to be vulnerable, or may not want, just to basically confide in one another. But if you look at the broader, let's say like legal industry and so on, there's other entrepreneurial like-minded people that were, talking about opportunities during this time and not just all the barriers that stood in the way. So that's why we started doing it. Like I just wanted to at least document how we were responding, what we were doing. Then we started featuring, a number of our clients and how they were responding and what they were doing. We weren't selling anything. It was just literally just the goal was to be, inspirational and informative, because there was just so much negativity, with everything with the news and, everything that was happening, even on social media and so on. Like you would think the world was ending, but we wanted to highlight examples of firms that were proactive during this time and that were growing, and like the things that you could do. So you felt that at least you had some options, which we all did. And then, in terms of how involved into a service offering, I don't know yet. I mean, so we got a lot of like, what we were doing, we got a lot of interest in it from other firms and saying, well, what would it take, if you guys do that for me and so on. So we're still kind of like thinking about it. I like to be very intentional with it. We're doing some of that on kind of like a case-by-case basis, but it's not something that's been opened up to the public yet. Because with anything that we do, and this is something I've realized now over the years, like I like to be very, very intentional about it, of making sure that it supports, coming back to our earlier discussion, that it supports our vision. And if it helps, let's say 1,000 law firm owners grow their revenues by $1 million each, it's probably a good idea. But if it's just something that can, let's say, drive revenue or, or whatever it is that may not tie into that, more often than not, I'll see it as a distraction, and, we'll kind of refocus back to, the vision.
Yeah, I don't know if, again, I don't know if it was intentional or not, but, I kind of compare my reaction to this setback with my reaction to the 2008 recession. A lot of similarities in terms of, how business went. I mean, the logistics were different, but it moved cheese for a lot of people. And I think the biggest difference for me was the example you showed and some other folks showed of not treating it as a snow day, not treating it as a defensive time, but to really go on the offensive. And I guess my observation was that by starting those vlogs and moments, it really changed the way Chris marketed itself. And that I'm sure you wouldn't have done it that way without the quarantine. But I think it shows sometimes that you can start out with something, and if you're intentional about it and self-reflective enough, it can morph into other things if you'll let it do that. And from an entrepreneurial standpoint, I think that's, sometimes we want to be masters of our own destiny, and we want to have the idea. But sometimes just something that fate drops in your lap can be great if you run with it.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I mean, this is one of the few times I think in history where, you would get a trophy just for participating. So like, meaning that, as the expression goes, like if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And there was a lot of, businesses, law firms, and so on that got very, very quiet. And their clients still needed them. I mean, they had just as much fear and uncertainty, but by not, going on the offensive, by not being proactive, by not, communicating and over communicating, I think there was a lot of opportunities that were lost. Whereas you could have gained a lot of like trust and credibility as a result of that. I mean, I would never say that we knew what was happening a month from now, or like where the pandemic would lead. I mean, that's not my area of expertise, but I could communicate, here's what we're doing, here's how we're responding. And it's interesting that the other firm owners that I spoke with that also were proactive during this time, that use this time to, develop their people, reinforce their processes, support their community at a higher level, all these things. They've had a pretty strong year. I mean, they've ended up like, it's so interesting, almost unanimously, they ended up, not only moving their law firm, probably several years forward, but also as a result, like, the revenue came too. These were the same ones that struggled with the same things, where the courts were closed, where the curfews were a problem, like every barrier that you would hear about, everything, they had the same barriers. I mean, we had a firm, I'll give you an example, one criminal defense firm in Waco, Texas, in a college town where the students were sent home, and he's had his best year ever,
Yeah. I've got a client who's a jewelry store, and I was watching a news report. They were doing this news report on how businesses were hurt in the holidays, and they were interviewing a jewelry store owner, someone I didn't know, and she was like, "Well, people not coming in, and there's not a whole lot we can do about it." And compare with my client who tried to figure out, okay, how can I do home jewelry sales? How can I do virtual jewelry sales? How can I, and as you say, he's had his best year because he's gotten out of his store and he's made, contactless deliveries and all these other things. And I think it's just a mindset of, if I can't make money the way I've always made money, then I'm not going to make money, as opposed to, okay, I've got this situation, how do I overcome it and be successful? And some people think one way and some people think the other. And do you think that can be taught, or is that just innate in the way people are wired?
Wow. Well, it's a loaded question. I've been thinking a lot about that over the last several months, especially in writing the second book. I think there's a part of it that is, is our upbringing, that kind of we develop a certain way through our experience with the world, and we see the world in a certain way. I think that's a part of it. But I do think so. It's kind of like with sports in a way. I think there's the innate talent that you're born with, but then there's also how you can improve and hone that talent. So if you're one of these people that, let's say was born being very risk tolerant and being very, let's say, let's just say that, skill, I think that's a valuable aspect of being an entrepreneur. But then you also hone that skill in terms of learning how to be a better leader and so on, that you've won both sides. But even if you weren't born in that way, but you still would hone those skills, you could still be very, very good. So it's kind of the difference between talent and skill. I think, skill is much more important because it's the one that you can develop and it's the one you can control. I will say, I think a huge testament to entrepreneurs this year, I mean, really globally, but, especially in America, I imagine that any entrepreneur that's listening, I think there was a point this year we all realized that to an extent we're on our own. So like meaning that the amount of flexibility and creativity you've had to see from entrepreneurs all across America. I mean, literally they'll say, okay, here are the curfews, here's the lockdowns, here's another barrier, here's another barrier, here's another thing you can't do. Like, I mean, if you're in the hospitality industry, if you're, I mean, in any industry, I mean, you're affected by this in some way. So you've had to almost kind of like figure out, okay, in spite of this, what do we need to do to kind of change our model to continue to succeed? And then you continue to be throwing more and more barriers. And I'm very pro business. So this is not a public health discussion or anything like that. I would just say that like there's businesses that have to support their teams and their families that, that really support their communities and so on. So they've had to be so creative this year and flexible to just even, support their own livelihood and continue to figure that out in spite of any kind of regulations or anything, anything new that would come down the pipe. But where I say, you're on your own, you don't have to be if you have, a community of supportive people that are also being very proactive. I think it's very difficult to do any of this alone. I certainly, I mean, there was, when COVID first hit, I kind of had maybe, I don't know, maybe half a day where I was thinking, what are we going to do? And then I had to snap out of it and do something. But the good news is that, I had great mentors. I have very, smart people on our leadership team and the team as a whole that, they were proactive. They came with insights, all these things that I did not have to do anything alone. I think self-made is a very kind of poor concept. I don't think any of us are self-made at the end of the day. I think there's always people that have helped us to get to where we are and that continue to help us. So anyway, I don't know necessarily where I was going with all this, but I was just going to say that I think entrepreneurs this year specifically deserve a lot of credit for not just even surviving, but how creative they've had to have been in spite of everything else.
I think that's right. And I'm a big believer in nobody's self-made. I don't care how much effort you put in yourself. If nothing else, somebody still has to pay you. You have to involve other people to be successful. And I know, Michael, you've certainly done that. You've got a great team there in Atlanta working for you. And I think one of the things that makes you successful is it's clear that you care about your customers and your clients and want to see them succeed. And going back to the beginning of our conversation, I've always thought it's interesting. Your mission statement isn't about your own success. It's about your customer's success. And that's not lost on me and a lot of other people.
I mean, there's a great book by Adam Grant. It's called Give and Take. And it talks about like givers, takers, and matchers. But the idea is that we succeed when we help somebody else win. And, when you have an impact goal that's tied to like helping somebody else succeed and helping somebody else win, I think that's what creates cash confidence. So meaning that, let's say we achieve the vision of helping 1,000 law firms grow their revenues by $1 million each. If we achieve that, like chances are we're not worried about where the next client's coming from because of how we've helped the previous 1,000. So if we make decisions on what's just going to help them succeed, like everything else comes as a byproduct. And now we make different decisions. We make decisions that aren't, are in the interest of our clients, that aren't necessarily in our own best interest. What's the right thing to do? What we prioritize experience, we prioritize results, all these different things. And I think that's been a model that's worked really well. I've seen it with a lot of very, very successful entrepreneurs and businesses. So when you can make it not about you, I think that keeps you going longer. And you also never let your foot off the gas because there's no necessarily end destination, if you will.
How's the new building coming?
That's another thing we did during COVID. Bought a building in basically in March of this year when every closing wasn't happening. Ours still was. We signed with masks and gloves. They're hard at work. It's going to be opening at the start of next year. It's been probably the biggest investment and project so far in my career. I mean, it's a 50,000 square foot building, and and even it's coming back to like we succeed when we help others win. 20,000 square feet of that is a training facility, and that's specific for our clients because we believe we can deliver a better experience when we can really control all aspects of that experience, as opposed to doing things, let's say at a hotel or airport or whatever it is, or another conference area. But it's the belief that experience matters. It's the belief that community matters. Just doing those things that we believe are the right thing to do. I guess time will tell. We'll find out next year if it is right or wrong. But I also believe that people want to be together. I think that as much as we've been apart this year, I think people want to come back to to sporting events. I think they want to come back to conferences and and all these different things because it's just human. It's almost like human nature, if you will. So we're betting heavily on that. But again, I would have never bought the building if we didn't have this vision. Because we always look backwards and say, okay, like working backwards from that vision, what has to be true, and this was one of those things. Like we had to have a venue where we could actually do these workshops continuously with how we wanted to grow and scale. So I would have never done it during COVID if we weren't committed to a vision, and we would have never been, committed to a vision if there wasn't one.
Right. Well, I think we've about come to the end of our time. I appreciate it, Michael. I had several more things on my list to talk about. Maybe we could do this again, maybe when the new book comes out. But for those of you that are interested, it's The Game Changing Attorney. Contact me. I can get you a copy, or you can get this at Amazon too, can't you, Michael? Or I bet you if you contacted Mogill, he would figure out a way to get you a book.
Sure.
It really is a great read, and even if you don't hire Chris, lots of really, really good ideas in here to help you build your law practice, and really any service business. You could learn a lot from that. Michael, again, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure to talk with you, and I agree with you. I'm looking forward to the next time I'm in Atlanta and we can break bread together.
Agreed. Alan, thank you for having me.
All right, very good. Thank you, everybody. I'm gonna steal a line from Michael. If you've enjoyed this podcast, and of course you did. Why wouldn't you have enjoyed it? Please share and like us on Facebook and on social media. Forward it in an email to somebody you think would enjoy it or benefit from it. Again, I'm Alan Crone, CEO of the Crone Law Firm. Thank you, and I'm going to go get some justice. Thanks.